Okay, so I'm set up now, and I'm obviously going to speak with you about the recent developments in Iran with regards to the war, and in particular, the idea that there is a now memorandum of understanding (MoU) that has been signed between Iran and the United States that indicates at least a 60-day ceasefire, but also steps that can be taken to secure an end to the war that's gone on for a little bit over 3.5 months now, and in varying degrees of active firing or ongoing economic warfare. This could be a promising development, but I think it's quite fragile. You may have woken to the news that Iran has reclosed the Strait of Hormuz, and to be as clear as possible, it has never been fully open. So the average traffic through the strait before the war began was in both directions around 120 to 150 ships a day. I believe somewhere around 40 ships exited the Strait of Hormuz this last week, which is more than had been going through in the previous weeks, but certainly not a resumption. And the reason that Iran has again closed the Strait of Hormuz, and we'll just have to see whether it can be resolved or whether this whole agreement that we're about to talk about may come to naught, is that one of the terms, one of the very first terms of this agreement, is that Israel will withdraw from cease hostilities in Lebanon, and that has not occurred. Right, on the one hand, there is a ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon, but the active combatant in Lebanon is, of course, Hezbollah. And it appears that Israel and Hezbollah have intermittently come to some kind of agreement, but that they don't see the agreement in the same way, that Hezbollah wants Israel to withdraw from Lebanon, that Israel is not willing to withdraw from Lebanon. And we'll have to wait and see. Does this scuttle the entire agreement? Can this be worked out? And I'll say it quickly at the outset, and then we can get into the details. Both the United States and Iran have considerable leverage over Israel on the one hand and Hezbollah on the other hand. And I think both have very powerful incentives for this war to end. And so the question may be whether or not Israel and Hezbollah can be brought to heel by the United States and Iran if this treaty is to succeed. So with that in mind, I will go into the details of the memorandum of understanding with you today, not because I think it's necessarily going to succeed or be binding. And by the way, if it is binding, it's only binding for 60 days. It's not a permanent treaty between the countries, but because I also think it's revealing, and it helps us to take stock of what has changed in the last 100+ days of war between the United States and Iran, but also in the broader world order. So it's an opportunity to do this. We've been talking in an ongoing way about the war, but really, I think in a way that just lets us stay up to speed on recent developments. This will be an opportunity to reflect in a more sustained way. I did intend to continue talking with you about artificial intelligence and technology this week. We will come back to that in subsequent weeks because we have more, I think, to be got out of those discussions. But for today, I want to start with the actual content of the Memorandum of Understanding. It has 14 points, and I want to discuss all 14 points with you. It also has some omissions, and I will talk about what's not in it briefly as well. I've decided to highlight in red the provisions that seem to me to favor Iran, and in yellow the provisions that seem to favor the United States, or that I believe Iran had placed in the document in red, the United States had placed in the document in yellow. So the other thing I'll just say very quickly, this is not the complete text of this agreement. It has much more verbiage in it than this, but I wanted to distill it and be able to present it to you in a concise way. So the first provision, the U.S. and their allies agree to immediately and permanently end military operations on all fronts, including in Lebanon. And if you read the full text, that language about including Lebanon actually occurs 3 times in this short paragraph. It's very clear that Iran needed assurance that Lebanon's integrity would be respected, but what that really means, of course, is that the ongoing degradation of Hezbollah's military capacity would come to an end. And so let me just spend a moment thinking about that with you. And it has, I think, 2 vantages that seem most relevant. The first is the Iranian, and here I'll just note very quickly, right? Iran views Hezbollah as a buffer and a deterrent between it and Israel. It believes if there isn't a credible strategic threat from close to Israel's border. And please note that Hezbollah is able to and has been firing into northern Israel, that broad swaths of northern Israel have been abandoned. The population has been relocated to get out of the range of the Hezbollah missiles. That this allows Iran to do immediate damage to Israel if Israel attacks Iran. And they believe that Israel, with Netanyahu at the helm, but perhaps more generally the populace of Israel, is committed to attacking Iran. And so they need this deterrent in place if they are going to be safe and secure. On the other hand, Israel regards Hezbollah akin to Hamas as an existential threat. They are still traumatized by what happened on October 7th. Understandably, they have come to regard allowing Iran's proxies to be close to their borders as a constant and urgent security threat. And so it's hard to know how the 2 sides come together. The idea, and this is now to return to the Israeli perspective, that an agreement that Israel was not a party to dictates to Israel how it must conduct itself and what it regards as its vital interests is very difficult for Benjamin Netanyahu or the Israeli public to accept. And this, I think, is at this point the weak link in this agreement. And it's interesting to note it's at the very beginning of the agreement and reiterated 3 times. Very quickly, points 2 and 3, the US and Iran agree to respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity and not interfere in each other's internal affairs. You will remember at the beginning of the war, Donald Trump said 3 things that are essentially equivalent. The first is that he was launching this war for regime change in Iran. The second was that he encouraged the people of Iran to rise up and overthrow their government. The third was that he would only accept unconditional surrender from Iran. There's a revealing statement before the war by Lindsey Graham saying that if the United States joined Israel in attacking Iran, we would have a Berlin Wall moment in the Middle East, right? A major impediment to peace, freedom, and prosperity in the Iranian regime would collapse. And of course, what Provision 2 says is that none of that happened, and the United States abandons, forswears those ambitions entirely. So this I think is a second place where we see the Iranian imprint on this document being very clear, and the idea that Iran had the upper hand in these negotiations. The US and Iran commit to negotiating and reaching a final deal within 60 days unless mutually extended. And as we'll see, right, we'll get into this when we get into the second half of the agreement. There is a commitment to negotiate Iran's nuclear program. I'll say this briefly. Nuclear program is a broad, vague term. Iran has nuclear power plants. It has demanded, as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty going all the way back to 1970, the right to enrich uranium up to the grade required for powering its power plants. And it is that what we're referring to when we refer to the nuclear program, or are we referring primarily to nuclear weapons? There's ambiguity there, and none of it is resolved by this document. So the idea that if this document incorporates a nuclear agreement, this document is not going to be solidified by a final agreement within 60 days. You may be aware Iran has negotiated in the era of the Islamic Republic exactly 2 international treaties, one of them with Iraq to end the Iraq-Iran war. That took several years to negotiate. And the other, the agreement with the United States and the Europeans to reduce and eliminate a large portion of its supply of enriched uranium, especially the highly enriched uranium, and to allow for international inspections of its ongoing nuclear program. And that deal took the better part of 2 years to negotiate. The idea, by the way, that these negotiations are highly technical, that the envoys that Donald Trump has appointed to negotiate with Iran, right, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, are not technical experts in these issues, and they have not been accompanied by technical experts in these issues. And finally, the idea that Iran, I think at this point, has twice been in negotiations with Trump's envoys, in the summer of 2025 and in the winter of 2026, that especially in the winter of 2026, Iran offered Donald Trump a better agreement in terms of the technical details than any agreement that it had ever before acceded to, including the Obama agreement. Iran seemed to understand that it needed to offer Trump a better deal because he was so critical of the Obama deal, and that it appears that Witkoff and Kushner and Trump did not recognize that this was a better deal, or were not interested. It's hard to know which is the case. All of this is to say, right, that I think anybody who looks at this thinks that this 60-day deadline is irrelevant. Right, it's just a number, and that the provision that matters is unless mutually extended. Iran, because it's been bombed twice by the Trump administration while negotiating with them, appears to have absolutely no confidence in negotiating with the Trump administration, and so most people believe that Iran will try to run out the clock on the Trump administration, drag negotiations over the next 2.5 years, rather than negotiating with a right partner it cannot trust. Similarly, you look at the text of this agreement, what it contains, what it doesn't contain, the specificity of some of the language, the vagueness of other parts of the language, and it appears that the Trump administration does not have the patience, the bandwidth, maybe the capacity for a serious negotiation right now either. And so the idea that this is just an infinitely extendable provision, I think, is the thing to notice about that provision. Fourth provision, The U.S. will begin removing its naval blockade immediately and fully end the blockade within 30 days. If you look at the language of that provision, you will see that there's a little bit more to it, and that specifically the United States has conditioned its willingness to remove the blockade on a proportionate removing of the embargo on traffic going through the Strait of Hormuz from Iran. And so I think that's important, but clearly this is a provision that Iran wants and needs. It needs to resume seafaring trade so that it can get resupplied with essential goods, so it can begin selling its goods and services as well. And the next provision, right, concerns that Iran will use its best efforts to ensure safe passage for commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz for 60 days with no charge. Right, so just noting these two provisions, 4 and 5 in tandem, 5 has not begun. Right, 20 ships have passed through, which is more than before, but today the Strait of Hormuz is closed. 4 has begun. The United States has begun removing the ships and would actually, if it wanted to go back on this, have to turn them around and reimpose the blockade. But I'll add, right, what is, I think, obvious in this, which is that this is only a 60-day agreement, right? And the idea that this returns us to the status quo ante. This is not a gain from where we were in February before the war began, but that it also has an expiration date of 60 days. And there's considerable talk among people speaking with Iranian diplomats and elsewhere in the region that Iran and Oman are going to, after the 60 days elapses, begin charging a fee. It may be a maintenance fee, it may be some sort of environmental fee. They won't call it a toll because they don't want to violate the law of the sea, which says that that is international water. But I would note, it does not say that Iran relinquishes any claim to sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. And quite to the contrary, Iran is making it clear with the 60-day limitation that it considers itself now to have a legitimate controlling interest in traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. This is actually a major change that is advantageous to Iran, acknowledged in a provision that the United States wanted in this agreement. Sixth provision. The U.S. and regional partners will develop a mutually agreed plan of at least $300 billion for Iran's reconstruction and economic development. And this is the one that has been very hard for many in the Republican Party to swallow. Bill Cassidy called this the worst foreign policy blunder in decades. Ted Cruz said something along the lines that it's always a bad idea to give billions of dollars to a theocracy that is your sworn enemy. This is a lot of money. I'll say very quickly that this doesn't mean the U.S. is giving this money. It's likely, as I understand it, although again it's vague and not clearly fleshed out in the document, to be a consortium of Gulf states. It may also be some Asian states for whom getting the oil flowing through the strait is certainly worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It may be some European states. And the European states, I'll say this quickly, have a very strong interest in the Iranian economy not failing and the Iranian state not failing. Because if there is a mass exodus of refugees from Iran, they will almost certainly go across the border in Turkey into Europe, and that would be destabilizing for Europe, incredibly expensive for Europe. There will be parties willing to donate this money. Now, will they receive the assurances, the transparency, the accountability for how the money is going to be spent. If this is a reconstruction and economic development fund, if this is, in other words, reparations, and who gains reparations in a negotiation, the victor or the victim of unjustified aggression. Again, implicitly, this agreement acknowledges that Iran emerges victorious and that the aggression was unjustified. But will we be secure? Will the contributors to this fund be assured that the money will be used for reconstruction and economic development as opposed to for funding the reconstitution of the Iranian military, which is demolished, or for funding proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi? Again, I think it's hard to know what's going to happen with this provision, but it is a clear indication that Iran felt it had the leverage in these negotiations that it could demand that this would be included. The U.S. will work, this is the seventh provision now, toward terminating all types of sanctions against Iran, including UN, IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, primary and secondary sanctions. And I would note, right, that this is the report from the from the Obama negotiators, that the Iranians were very astute, very well prepared, very detailed, meticulous in the way they negotiated the original nuclear treaty with the United States. And the language here, right? All sanctions specified, including primary and secondary sanctions. There's more to it in the actual text. It's a very strong commitment. And to be clear, this provision is probably worth $5 to $10 billion per month to Iran. And so we put together the sixth and the seventh provision, a provision that we haven't gotten to yet, but the money that is frozen in American accounts, the Iranian assets, are also to be released. This agreement is worth probably around $400 billion to Iran if all of that money is given in 2026 this year, right? And then it's worth, who knows, tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to Iran in perpetuity. It doesn't just allow Iran now to sell oil on the world market without any sanction, and so for whatever the prevailing price is for oil. Also, and now I need to move forward. The 10th provision, very quickly, the U.S. will issue waivers for Iranian crude oil, petroleum products, derivatives, and associated banking, insurance, and transportation services. This essentially allows Iran to use the financial infrastructure of the United States or of the dollar and credit system to finance the sale of its oil. And I'll say this very quickly. Iran has been, since it's been under sanctions, primarily selling its oil demarcated in Chinese currency. And there's significant disadvantages to doing that in terms of the access to the petrodollar system, which is a much more sophisticated system for financing credit swaps, etc., for trading of oil. This is independently valuable to Iran, and I want to make it as clear as possible. What this essentially means is the normalization of Iran within the world economic system, having been a pariah state for most of the last 50 years, having been unable to be fully integrated into the global economy. Taken together, these provisions promise much greater wealth for Iran. I'll say it very quickly. The Iranian people, not the regime, are a very well educated, hard working, commercially promising people. If they are able to gain access to global markets, again, this could be very important for, right, Iran rebuilding itself, but also for the regime restabilizing itself. The regime was in trouble prior to the beginning of the war. The main reason that there were widespread protests throughout the country is because the economy was collapsing. Inflation was runaway. And this is in part because of the international sanctions, the incapacity of Iran to sell its most valuable resource openly on the international markets or to use the financial instruments necessary to sell them, in part because of the isolation of the Iranian people from the global economy. This could be transformative in a way that stabilizes and assures the longevity of the Iranian regime. So let me go back now. The eighth point, Iran reaffirms that it will not procure or develop nuclear weapons and agrees to address its enriched material stockpile under IAEA supervision. And this is extremely important to the United States, to Israel, to Europe, to many places in the world, right? There's a consensus that Iran cannot have nuclear weapons in order for the region and the world to remain safe and stable from Iranian aggression. I would note the word reaffirms, right? So Iran agreed to this in 1970 when it signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. That's the Shah, right? But the right Islamic Republic did not withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They agreed to this again in 2015, 2016 under the Obama era agreement. This is not a new position from Iran and agrees to address its enriched material stockpile. This is, I think, worthwhile noting. Donald Trump has said on several occasions that he thinks that Obama's treaty was the worst treaty the United States ever negotiated. That treaty removed almost all of Iran's enriched and much of its overall uranium stockpile. I'm just going to show you this very quickly. I'll get to the details of this later, but this is how much enriched uranium Iran had in 2015 after the deal is implemented. As you can see, almost no enriched uranium. And it's not just what this deal seems to envision, which is diluting the uranium, but Iran maintaining control of the uranium, because diluted uranium can be re-enriched rather rapidly. In this deal, it was removed from Iran entirely, right? And so when we compare what this deal promises with what the deal that Trump withdrew from contained, this does not seem to be obviously superior. Until a final deal is reached, Iran will maintain the current status quo of its nuclear program, while the U.S. will impose no new sanctions and deploy no additional forces. I think that's pretty straightforward. The 10th point now, I'm sorry, 11th point, we've already talked about the 10th. The U.S. will make frozen or restricted Iranian funds and assets fully available for use. There are conflicting reports about how much this amounts to, somewhere between the mid-20s and nearly $50 billion in assets. Again, a very large figure. And I didn't put the exact language in here, but the exact language says that these funds can be accessed by any entity within Iran designated by the Iranian government. And I would note that there are many entities within Iran, like the Islamic Republican Guard, who I would think the United States does not want to have access to tens of billions of dollars. The rest of the verbiage I'm not going to get bogged down on. It's more promissory or legalistic that this will all be solidified and codified once the negotiations have been signed, but the negotiations, please note, were supposed to start on Friday. Iran delayed the beginning of the negotiations because Israel bombed Lebanon, killing almost 50 people on Friday. And so we don't know yet when that will occur. The last thing I want to mention here very briefly is what's not in this memorandum, right? So, among other things, what will happen to the enriched material in Iran's stockpile? But also, any detailed commitment on the nuclear program, any mention of missiles or proxies, right? And so one of the major rationales for this war is that Iran had missiles that could strike Israel or Europe, and that they were using those missiles to protect the nuclear program, and also that Iran had its proxies in and around Israel, and that they were a deep threat to Israel. That is not mentioned in this agreement at all. It's part of the reason Netanyahu and the Israelis are so critical of this agreement. So let me talk a little bit more about the implications of this agreement and then get into the analysis. Um, we we heard Donald Trump in Versailles at the G7 meeting earlier this week say he didn't want to be Herbert Hoover. He didn't want to be the president who caused a major global economic crisis. And I think what this acknowledges is that the United States requires the Strait of Hormuz to be open for it to have security, that its economy and the global economy into which it is deeply integrated will not suffer major fragility or a recession or depression. Will this agreement actually secure the opening of the Strait of Hormuz? And I think the answer to that is we really don't know yet. And it really depends on the action of other actors who the United States and Iran cannot simply control, Israel and Hezbollah. And so the idea that the agreement may or may not reopen the strait, I think, is worth noting. Markets, right, and in particular, this kind of commodity market where you're buying futures, you're buying something to be delivered 30 or 60 days hence, depend on reliability and dislike uncertainty. So oil prices have come down about 10%. Gas prices in the United States have come down a similar amount. Will they continue to come down? And here I think there are two factors. The first is not fully, certainly not to anything like where they were before the war began, but perhaps even not reflective of the supply of oil on the market if there's not some confidence, security that this is a permanent agreement. But then we add, and I've got a map on the board here. The language, the text is too small to really make out, but these are all the facilities in the Gulf for extracting, processing, delivering oil that have been damaged in the war by Iranian attacks. And there are over a dozen of them. Some of them are very technical, complex, intricate facilities. It may take months or years to repair them. And by the way, note that there's a limited supply of the people with the technical know-how to repair these facilities. They may have to wait in line for the personnel to become available. So there may be somewhere between a half year and a 5-year lag in the resumption of the full supply of oil. And then note, in ways that we talked about last week, that there's been a rapid diminution of the global inventory of stored oil in government and industry reserves, and they're going to have to replenish those reserves, and that is going to also create additional demand, which will increase the price of oil. So I think just worth noting, the president says, start your engines, let the oil begin to flow. He says, right, the price of gas will drop like a rock as soon as the war is over. I suspect it's going to be slower, more uneven, and certainly not going down to where it was before the war began anytime soon. I'll just add that inflation has gone up, growth has gone down. The right cost of this war measured in growth is at least $2 trillion to the global economy. I'll give you on the next slide a little bit of data on inflation. This is the best diagram I could find that gives you global data on a comparative basis over time. And so what this shows is the size of the economy for which we have data. The US is the big blue dot, the Chinese are the big red dot, right? And it shows it in a sequence of years. 2020, inflation was non-existent, right? We were in the midst of the COVID recession. We were actually in a deflationary period. In 2021 and 2022, when governments spent a lot and borrowed a lot in order to prop up their economies in the aftermath of the COVID recession, inflation went up. 2023, 2024, 2025, the governments began to feel more confident, began to increase interest rates. Inflation began to come down, not all the way to where it was in 2020, but below 4%, which is not runaway inflation. Obviously, the target in the United States is below 2%. This seemed to be heading in the right direction, but please note, in 2026, across the board, it is coming up again. Not as bad as 2023, but not as good as 2024 or 2025. This war is primarily responsible for the return of inflation and the simultaneous drop in economic growth. That's called stagflation. This is what gave the Iranians so much leverage. They, in a sense, were threatening the viability, the resilience of the global economy. And here we get into the territory that is unknown. How fragile or resilient are the American and the world economies? And there does appear to be some resilience, and I think it's worthwhile acknowledging the largest energy shock in the history of the modern economy occurred over the last 3.5 months, and it didn't cause a global recession or crisis. But we don't know how close we got, and we won't know until we get there. And by the way, right, I've been talking a little bit about COVID, about stimulus, about what governments did. They borrowed, they went into debt. And when, right, inflation kicks in, interest rates go up, the debt becomes more difficult to service, to pay down, it becomes more expensive. We are seeing signs of fragility in the global economy, especially with regards to the financing of government debt. And nobody wants this to go on in a way that lets us find exactly where that threshold of fragility is. This is why Iran felt it had the leverage. This is why Trump felt he had to negotiate this deal, despite the provisions in it that are obviously advantageous to Iran, disadvantageous to the United States and Israel. So, looking at the three, and I'm saying three, maybe I should really say four. I'm not looking at Hezbollah independently yet, but the three primary actors, Iran, the US, and Israel in this war, right? It was a three-way war. Iran clearly emerges more powerful. Its military has been damaged tactically, there's no doubt about that, but it has obtained what war theorists call escalation supremacy. It has a weapon it can use that does more damage to us than any weapon that we have that we can, in good conscience or legally, use against them. I'll say this briefly. I believe that Donald Trump, in a late night impetuous tweet, threatened Iran with nuclear war. And obviously, he walked that back. He probably never meant it. But this was his effort to regain escalation supremacy. What can we do to Iran that's worse than their closing the Strait of Hormuz? Frankly, not anything available to us with conventional military force. By the way, the other thing maybe we could do would be a land invasion, but Donald Trump knows that boots on the ground is a quagmire. It's a commitment for maybe years or decades, and he does not want to be that kind of president. The American people do not want him to be that kind of president. And so there's limits with what we can do with air power, and it's not as great as the damage that Iran can do to us with its cheap drones. I didn't really go into this, right? But at the very beginning, I had on my slide not just the image of the three Ayatollahs, right? The Khamenei, and Mustafa, the new Khamenei, the new supreme leader of Iran, and Donald Trump, but also of, I think, the most relevant weapons in this war. And so this is the drone. This is the weaponized drone that Iran fires at the ships that are brave or foolish enough to try to traverse the Strait of Hormuz when it's not giving them permission to. These are the weapons that we fire. This is a THAAD battery system to knock down those weapons. These weapons, the cost estimate varies, but at most they cost $30,000. These missiles cost over $1 million. This system costs $500 million, right? And so the idea that we're in an era of asymmetrical warfare, we're in an era where the fact that we spend more than 1,000 times annually on our military what Iran spends on its military does not deliver escalation supremacy, because Iran can build cheap missiles and exhaust our supply of expensive missiles, because Iran sits astride the Strait of Hormuz and can use its cheap and easily made missiles to choke the traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. This is the fundamental lesson of this war. I don't mean to belabor it, but the idea that, frankly, although all the war planning games had always said, if you attack Iran, this is what they will do, Iran had never tried to do it. It wasn't until the United States and Israel made it clear that their mission in this war was existential. They wanted to destroy and replace the Iranian regime, that Iran decided it would have recourse to its weapon of last resort. And lo and behold, it worked better, I think, than anyone had anticipated that it would. And Iran now knows this. It can shut down the strait, and there's not much that anyone can do about it. It is therefore coming out of this war much more powerful and emboldened to demand recognition, right, within these negotiations. Reparations, 300 billion plus, removal of the sanctions, and hence economic normalization. I think this undoubtedly bolsters the legitimacy of this regime in the eyes of the people of Iran. It probably restores its power and may very well stabilize this regime for decades to come. The United States clearly leaves this conflict diminished. It became obvious that we are deeply vulnerable to weaponized interdependence, to the use of economic weapons against us, that we needed the strait open to avert economic and political risks, right? It didn't help that we were coming up on a midterm election with an already unpopular president and a polarizing figure, and a man who had promised not to start wars and went ahead and started a war of choice. Um, I'll just say this very directly, that J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, many other members of the administration are trying to spin the agreement, to say that there are back channel discussions that aren't in the agreement to minimize the appearance of humiliating defeat. But I think having looked over the 14 points in the memorandum of understanding, it is quite clear that we gave Iran what it wanted because we felt we couldn't hold out for anything better, and that Iran gave us very vague and limited assurances that we would get anything that we wanted. Finally, Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu emerged from this war isolated, scorned, right? And I want to be as clear as possible. We have Canada, France, Norway, Australia, and New Zealand setting up a sanctions regime against Iran. We have Donald Trump telling Benjamin Netanyahu that he's lost the support of the American people for a generation because of the way that he pulled us into this war. I mean, this is self-serving on Trump's part, but also because of the way the Iranians have conducted themselves in Gaza, in Lebanon, and vis-a-vis Iran. And so the idea that they're losing their allies, they're losing their support, they're increasingly regarded as a rogue or pariah regime, and then add to that that they are deeply dissatisfied with the memorandum of understanding, what it gives to Iran, hundreds of billions of dollars, what it doesn't get from Iran, anything but vague assurances on the nuclear program, or anything whatsoever with Hezbollah or Hamas. And so it's put Israel in a nearly impossible position. Defy the treaty or the agreement, um, and you deeply alienate the leader of your most important ally, or abide by the agreement, but then you are abiding by an agreement that strengthens your most important rival. Please note, right, eventually the United States articulated its military goals. The IDF was a little clearer at the beginning. None of the war goals have been met. And, right, Iran will likely strengthen, right, its ability to threaten Israel. And anything that Israel might want will be deferred, I think, for a very long time. I haven't mentioned Hezbollah. I'll just say it very quickly, right? Hezbollah clearly wants to not disarm. It is both a political party and a paramilitary organization. It does not want to become only a political party, and Iran does not want Hezbollah disarmed. Will there be some give on the part of Hezbollah, enough to allow Israel to accede to this bitter pill? I don't know. I'm a little skeptical. So, with that out of the way, I want to talk for a few minutes about the broader implications. And I've already basically talked with you about America and Iran's power positions, which are fundamentally altered. Iran is, and I'm sorry I made a mistake there. I did not mean to say global power. I meant to say regional power. But you may have noticed that Iran and the Saudis entered negotiations this last week about normalizing diplomatic relations and beginning regional cooperation. And the reason I think it's worth stating is because the Saudis have concluded that the United States security umbrella is ineffective. We cannot protect the Saudis or the Kuwaitis or the Qataris from aggression from Iran. That's been demonstrated the last few months. And so Iran, and if they're going to be safe from Iran, they need to secure themselves through direct cooperation with Iran. This is going to, again, make Iran stronger, Regionally, it appears that they are probably the most powerful country in the region. The US, much less so in ways I'll get into in a few minutes. Israel's standing with vital allies is in peril. The world economy is undergoing important transformations as many countries do what they can to minimize their reliance on fossil fuel. Having, right, the supply of fossil fuel exposed as fragile and um, easily interrupted by war in Iran, by war in Ukraine, by right rogue countries limiting the supply. So very quickly, coming back to the US, the language that I find most persuasive to describe what's happened to us is that this has been a Suez moment for us. If you remember Britain in the Suez crisis, right, tried to project its power, and essentially the United States, Eisenhower said, no, back off. And it became apparent then that Britain was no longer a superpower. And our overreach, the incoherence of our strategy reveal that although we are the most powerful military in the world, we can no longer really command the power in a way that projects it into the rest of the world. That we are declining and rivals are rising, that's China, but also Iran and Russia, for instance, regionally. And so that we emerge from this war diminished and substantially diminished. And I want to say this directly, the problem here, the difficulty here, is not merely for Donald Trump. As someone who's no great fan of Donald Trump, we might be inclined to in a sense, if not celebrate, at least engage in a little bit of I told you so. But this is going to be bad for the next president of the United States, for a generation of American leadership. We've got to hope that some of those presidents will be better men or women than Donald Trump, who will want to use the power of the United States for good purposes and not just for ill. And they're not going to be able to do it. The idea that we have reputational planning from reputational damage from the poor planning, the incoherent messaging, the immoral threatening, and the possibly criminal conduct of this war. More fundamentally, Donald Trump took the nation into an unwinnable war without a publicly stated justification or democratic authorization. Even today, he's saying what I said a few days ago is not what I said, right? It just totally, right? And I'm tempted to say incoherent, contradictory, hypocritical messaging. But messaging isn't right, because when you're the president of the United States and you bring your country into war, you need your people's support. So what you say publicly is not just spinning, it's actually seeking the consent of the people for the most dangerous of undertakings. And Donald Trump failed to do that. He also had no strategy for how to respond if Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. And when I say he had no strategy, it's worthwhile noting this was anticipated for decades by the US military, and it appears they had no strategy either. So it's just grossly irresponsible to have done this. And then note, no exit strategy either if Iran did not surrender. So in all these regards, we look like a failing and diminished power. This will be a lasting impression. And our allies, right, Britain, France, Canada, the Saudis, are angry and frustrated at us, right? We've disregarded their interests, we've abused their leaders, and they are looking for ways to reconfigure their security relations, their international agreements so that they're less reliant on an unreliable, irresponsible partner in the United States. The fact that Trump was elected twice, I think, is really deeply disconcerting to the rest of the world. If he's elected once and we correct, they may be able to say, well, that was an aberration. But the fact that he's elected twice means that they have to say, perhaps the roots of Trump are institutional and may remain in place after he's gone. Look at the Electoral College. Look at how fractured the United States is. Look at how isolationist and indebted to disinformation the Republican Party has become, and it's one of their two main parties. This is, again, I think, part of the reputational damage. This is not this war alone, right? This is the tariffs and the abuse of the leaders of the countries that have been our most reliable allies. This is the shift, right, in the role of America in the world that Donald Trump wants to bring about. He thinks we've been suckers to be institution builders, to be bound by the rule of law. I think most of the world does not view it that way. I'm saying a more than rhetorical, principled commitment to a world's order structured by impartial and humane laws that treat nations equally and promote human rights, trade, and prosperity. And when I say more than rhetorical, I am not saying that this has been a fundamental, abiding, principled commitment. We've actually always done this, but we have been bound at points by our rhetoric to do what a ordered, structured, law-abiding world order requires of us. And it appears that Donald Trump views that as a sucker's game and wants us to be a predatory hegemon, to use our power to get what we want. He really hoped that we would do to Iran what we did to Venezuela, end up being able to take their oil, right? That's not the kind of country we have been. Has Donald Trump created an appetite in the Republican Party for this kind of foreign policy going forward? By the way, the anti-institutionalism of Trump's foreign policy is just an echo of the anti-institutionalism of his domestic politics, right? The Justice Department has been completely crushed in its spirit as an independent institution of the rule of law. He's doing this at home and abroad and creating an appetite for this in the American public. And so this is generating an identity crisis for the world. I'm going to wrap up. I will just do two things very quickly. Put this on the board, right? Which is I don't know, frankly, if there's even going to be meaningful nuclear negotiations in the next 2.5 years. I kind of suspect that there won't be because the Iranians don't trust Trump and Trump doesn't have the patience for it. But having said that, at least look at the standards, right? In 2016, we were able to get Iran to relinquish, to export almost all of its highly enriched uranium. We were able to get them from a 2 to 3 month breakout period to a 12 plus month breakout period, to reduce all their uranium to 3.67% enriched. Now they have it up to 60% enriched, so they're a couple weeks away from making a nuclear weapon. We don't know what's happening with their centrifuges because there haven't been inspections, but under the Obama plan, they decreased dramatically, right? And then their missiles, this is the inventory of the kinds of missiles and the numbers of missiles and the range of missiles. This is all the stuff that we would have to negotiate diligently, carefully, doggedly, and I guess we can just watch as we go forward. Will any of the benchmarks of the previous agreement be met? by whatever emerges from these negotiations. One more thing I'll say, because I haven't said it at all, but I do think it's extremely important. The world economy is going to be changed by this. The idea that we can have a global economy that primarily relies on a steady and cheap flow of petroleum. That is the model of globalization that we've had for the last 70 years. It is a disaster for the planet, right? It is the primary contributor to climate change. And so I do believe that many of the countries of the world are looking at this and saying the supply of oil that can be deeply diminished by Iran, by Russia, by an international pandemic. The supply of sunshine and wind is not that mercurial. Let us transition as quickly as possible. And then I will just add, who makes the most batteries in the world? The best batteries, the most affordable. Similarly for solar panels, similarly for wind turbines. And the same holds for electric cars. And you know the answer, it's China. It's not the United States. We have essentially surrendered the competition for alternative and renewable energy. The coup de grace was solidified or signed into law this week when the Trump administration paid a major energy supplier $750 million, $750 million to not develop an offshore wind account. And so don't get me wrong. I think in a sense, this might be the only silver lining in what I say to you today. The rapid transition to renewable energy is absolutely what we need. But the idea that this will be bad for the United States, and I referred to us as a more than rhetorical, uh, uh, having a more than rhetorical commitment to a rules-based order. If the United States sinks and China rises, if the United States withdraws and China and Russia and Iran rise, I don't think we're going to have a better global order. All right, I will stop there. I want to hear your thoughts, your questions. Obviously, this gives an opportunity to return to this topic, which we've been just paying a little bit of attention to over the last few weeks with some details. Who wants to start us out with thoughts or comments?
It's Anne. It
Oh,
doesn't seem.
okay. Thank you, Anne. I was seeing multiple people light up at the same time. Go ahead, Anne.
Oh, I just started. I mean, I think we've seen this from the beginning, and it's just so depressing that Trump and stupid and the word negotiate, forget it as far as anybody in Trump's. They don't have the patience, and they aren't going to be able to find people with enough talent to do it. So it's nothing's going to happen, and we're just so diminished, and it's very depressing.
Yeah, yeah, I can't disagree with you, Anne. I'm sorry, I can't. If you're looking at it through a partisan lens, maybe the idea that this takes the wind out of the sails of Donald Trump's party heading into the midterm elections, but that does not compensate, right?
Right.
If you're looking at it from looking for any shred of good news in this, maybe the accelerated transition into alternative energy sources. But yes, this is a disaster for the United States, and not just for Donald Trump. In a sense, like so much of what he's done in his life, it'll be his successors who have to pick up the pieces and suffer the consequences.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's all of us. So yes, and Donald Trump yesterday, the day before, said, uh, this is just a memorandum of understanding. And if we don't like the way they act, we can start bombing them again. I think maybe he is starting to learn the lesson that, in a sense, other presidents, and here I'll just note, right, the military, at the request of every president since Jimmy Carter, has prepared plans to invade Iran. And every president not named Trump has seen those plans and concluded this is a fool's errand. Does he learn? In the way that Russia is still, or I should say, Putin is still struggling to learn. The larger military, the more technologically equipped, the larger economy, the larger society, does not automatically prevail, especially in conditions of asymmetrical war. Yeah, thank you, Anne. Flossie, it looked like, oh, John, go ahead.
Well, it just occurs to me that the underlying, if you wanted to tell a technological story about this, the invention of the drone has probably been the most significant thing since the invention of the atomic bomb in structuring how warfare is going to occur.
Yeah, and I'm sure you know these stories from World War II. For instance, the Poles. I'm sorry, World War II. Yeah, I guess it is World War II. The
Hard
Poles
to remember.
Poles sending their cavalry to greet the German tanks and machine guns, right? On horses, right? And so they're just mowed down. And so the idea, yes, that there's been a fundamental technological transformation of warfare. We're calling it asymmetrical because, right, you end up with a paramilitary, a ragtag army being able to build drones. I mean, I love the story with Ukraine that for the first months of the war, until they developed their capacity to make them, they ordered them on Amazon from China, right? This is a different world where all of a sudden we can remotely control airborne weapons that can take out weapons, tanks, missile systems, right? We really haven't tallied the cost of this war. I saw one of the think tanks thinks it's over $130 billion, right? The Department of Defense or Department of War puts it at 29 billion. They seem to have lost track of $100 billion of damaged equipment and diminished supplies. But yes, I completely agree, John. That the technological transformation underpins then all of these strategic considerations. Flossie, please go ahead. You have to unmute. You're still muted right now. Flossie, can you push down the space bar or the...
Say it again.
There you go. Go ahead.
Lost our identity. What we have now is a way of thinking that billionaires can buy their safety, buy an island somewhere and get lost. But to be an American doesn't have any meaning anymore. It's like every man for himself. The more money he has, the more ways he has or she has or we have to escape. There isn't a sense of unity. Who are we? We had an identity. We don't have it anymore. It's like every billionaire for himself. That's what makes me feel that we've lost more than
A war.
us the sense of being unified, of being able to say, this is not what we do as Americans. We're not American anymore. That meant something once. Now it's disappearing. Not little by little, but every day there's another indication that we don't know who we are and what we want. So God bless us all. Thank goodness, no.
Flossie, I'm gonna echo what you say by noticing something that happened last week that I haven't spoken with you about, right? On the one hand, I think it was Saturday night, June 14th was, maybe it was Sunday night, Flag Day, and the president's birthday. What did we do? We had a gladiatorial spectacle, an ultimate fighting club, in which, right, people bloodied themselves and, just screamed misogynistic, terrible partisan stuff from the White House lawn. And then note that this Friday was Juneteenth, right? A new national holiday to celebrate the final abolition of slavery. And as far as I can tell, the White House was moot. Not a word about it. So I'll say this briefly. I think we've lost our decency. I think we're losing our values. And I want to indicate that there is a partisan basis for this. And one of the things I'm going to be looking at as we approach the midterm elections, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump have both lied without any compunction in the last week about what's in this agreement, right? Donald Trump called the idea that there was $300 billion for Iran in this agreement a fake news. But before the document had been released, when people were just wondering what's in it, and then we get the document, there's $300 billion for Iran in it, right? It wasn't fake news, but the president doesn't want to own it. So he thinks that his friends on Fox and in the right-wing media ecosystem will give him a pass. Will that happen, right? Will the Trump base turn out for their president who promised no new wars, who promised to bring the price of groceries and gas down, who promised he would restore their economic security, when in fact he's done nothing of the kind? If so, then maybe there's a little bit left to the values, the resilience, the intelligence of the American electorate taken as a whole. And I just think it's a really important test of how deeply damaged our information environment is, or to put it differently, whether or not we still care that the president lies to our faces and thinks he can get away with it. Yeah, I think that might be a good note to wrap up on today. I'm looking through the audience. I see a number of people who I suspect might be fathers. I'll wish you a happy Father's Day one day in advance. Good being with you guys as always. Be well and see everybody next week. I'm sure there will be plenty to talk about, but my plan is to resume talking about technology. There's been really interesting stuff happening just in the last week, but obviously we needed to talk about this as well. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Great
Thank you,
pleasure as
David.
always. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.